Jason Statham silences a smug talk show host with nothing but truth and grit. Witness the unforgettable interview that left a studio speechless and the world inspired. Like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this powerful moment of raw honesty. The studio was an empire of illusion. Gleaming lights, polished floors, strategically placed cameras that captured every flicker of expression and every shift in posture. The crowd, packed tightly into velvet rows, was buzzing with electric anticipation. Tonight wasn't just another celebrity interview. It was the season premiere of The Spotlight, the high-profile talk show hosted by none other than Victor Harland, a man famous not for his empathy, but for his ego. Victor had made a career out of dissecting guests like frogs under a microscope. Politicians, actors, CEOs, no one left his set unbruised. He smiled like a salesman, talked like a prosecutor, and listened like a man waiting to interrupt. He was cunning, surgical, and merciless. His questions often veiled as compliments only to be twisted into barbs the moment someone dared relax. But tonight, his guest was Jason Statham. The camera light turned red. The crowd hushed. Music boomed through the sound system. Victor adjusted his tie and looked straight into the lens. "Ladies and gentlemen," he purred, "our guest tonight is someone who needs no introduction. A man who's made millions by being tough, silent, and, let's face it, typecast. Give it up for Jason Statham." Applause thundered. Jason walked out from behind the curtain, every step deliberate. No big smile, no waves, no forced charm. Just presence. He wore a charcoal gray suit that hugged his frame, his expression unreadable as always, stone with a heartbeat. He didn't play to the crowd. He didn't need to. He was Jason Statham. Victor stood arms wide. "Jason, my man," he said too loudly, offering a handshake that was more about the cameras than respect. Jason shook it with the minimal energy required to be polite. Then he took his seat, legs planted firmly, hands resting on his thighs, body angled slightly away from the host. Victor grinned and leaned in, fingers steepled. "So let's get right to it, shall we?" His voice was smooth like melted wax, but thick with condescension. "You've been in over 30 films. Explosions, car chases, fistfights. Basically, if someone's getting thrown through glass, it's probably you." A few chuckles from the audience. Victor's smile widened. "But here's the real question. Do you ever feel bored? You know, being Hollywood's go-to for playing the guy who grunts and punches his way through script? Ever think of stretching yourself a bit?" The crowd tensed. A few people glanced nervously toward the stage. They had seen Victor pull this stunt before, make the guests laugh, lull them into a false sense of comfort, then go for the jugular. Most folded, a few spar back, but no one had ever truly won. Jason didn't blink, didn't smirk, didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly, eyes locking onto Victor's with the kind of calm that could either be respect or warning. "I'm curious," Jason said, voice gravelly and slow. "Why do you think that's a good first question?" Victor blinked, momentarily thrown. "Well," he said, recovering with a laugh, "it's not about being good or bad. It's just honest. You're great at what you do, but you're not exactly winning Oscars, are you?" Laughter erupted from parts of the crowd. Others remained dead silent. Jason leaned back, his body still relaxed, but his eyes were coiled springs. Victor mistook the quiet for surrender. "I mean, come on, Jason. When people think of great actors, they think of transformation. Daniel Day-Lewis, Joaquin Phoenix, you know? Not just guy walks into a warehouse and punches 10 men in the face." Jason didn't respond right away. He reached for the glass of water in front of him, took a slow sip, then placed it back on the table with the same care he'd used loading a gun. Then he leaned forward, hands clasped, elbows on his knees. "You ever been punched, Victor?" Victor blinked. What?" "In the face. Not metaphorically. Not in a boxing class you paid too much for. I mean, properly hit. Enough to make your vision go sideways. Enough to make you wonder if you'll ever get up again." Victor laughed, awkward now. "Well, no, I don't think that's relevant, is it?" Jason stared. "See, I've taken those hits," he said calmly. "On set. Off set. Growing up, I've been hit harder than most people ever will. and I get back up. Every time. And when I do it in a film, people feel that. Not because it's acted well, but because it's lived well. The crowd was no longer chuckling. Jason continued, his voice low and steady. You think acting's only about accents and crying on cue? You think pain's only real when it's delivered in a monologue? Some of us didn't grow up learning Shakespeare. We grew up learning how to take a hit and still keep moving. Victor leaned back slightly, trying to appear amused, but his jaw tightened. Jason tilted his head. You ever lose something, Victor? A dream? A chance? A family member? You ever been so broke you couldn't afford pint? You ever sleep on a couch, hoping tomorrow you'd be someone different? Victor opened his mouth, but Jason cut him off. No, you haven't. You've sat in that chair, safe, smug, tossing words like knives at people who've bled for what they have. Now the crowd was utterly silent, save for the creak of someone leaning forward in their seat. Jason's tone was calm, but carried the weight of steel. You said I don't transform? He asked. Mate, I transformed a long time ago. From a broke kid selling knockoff cologne on the streets of London to a man people pay millions to see because they believe I don't stay down. Because I don't quit. That's transformation. That's real. Victor looked down at his cards, suddenly unsure of which one to play. Jason leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. So ask me about the movies. Ask me about the training, the risks, the broken bones. But don't ask me if I ever stretched myself. I've been stretching since the day I learned what hunger felt like. He paused. And if that doesn't impress you, that's fine. But it sure as hell impresses the people who've been where I've been. A ripple of applause started near the back. Then more joined. Then more. Victor gave a thin smile. But it was the kind of smile a man gives when he's backed into a corner and still trying to pretend he's comfortable. Jason looked around, taking in the audience, the lights, the studio with its walls of pretense and illusion. Then he turned back to Victor and said, Anything else you want to ask me, mate? Victor stared, not sure how to answer. The game he had mastered, the power dynamic he always controlled, had been completely undone. And it wasn't by yelling or bravado. It was by truth. Raw, undeniable, unshakable. And just like that, the tension that had been building all night snapped. But not in Victor's favor. The lights in the studio didn't dim, but they might as well have. Something invisible had shifted, an energy, a weight, hanging over every camera, every crew member, every member of the audience now watching not an interview, but a reckoning. Victor Harland cleared his throat. He was the kind of man who prided himself on composure, on being untouchable. But right now, sitting across from Jason Statham, calm, unflinching, deadly in his restraint, he felt it. The loss of control. He chuckled weakly, tapping the edge of his stack of blue index cards. Well, Jason, he said, feigning amusement, you've certainly got away with words. Jason didn't reply. He didn't need to. Victor glanced at the monitor behind the camera, checking the feed. He knew the moment was already viral. The control room was probably in chaos, directors waving, producers muttering into earpieces. This wasn't the clip they wanted, but it was the clip the world would watch on repeat. He leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk in front of him. Let's talk about something a little lighter, shall we? His smile returned, but his voice was brittle now. You've got a new film coming out. Another action flick. Explosions, fast cars, tough guy stuff. Same old, same old. There was again. The subtle jab. The backhanded compliment. A play straight from Victor's book. Jason didn't blink. Is that a question, Victor? The host gave a hollow laugh. All right. Let's make it a question, then. Don't you ever get tired of it? The same roles, the same stunts, the same fight choreography? Aren't you hungry for something deeper? Jason's eyes narrowed. Not in anger, but in focus. He leaned forward slightly. Deeper. Victor nodded. Yeah, something with substance. Something that doesn't end with a slow-motion explosion and a one-liner. Jason tilted his head, studying the man across from him like a hawk circling something that just twitched. Let me ask you something, Victor. When's the last time you were on a set at 4 a.m., with your ribs taped up, running on 3 hours of sleep, about to jump off a moving train for the 12th take? Victor smirked, but it faltered. Jason continued, his voice low and steady. When's the last time you put 6 months into training for a single scene? Learned how to drive a car backwards at 60 miles an hour? When's the last time you had to shoot a fight in one take, knowing if you missed a punch, someone could go to the hospital? He paused. That's not shallow. That's not lazy. That's not same old. That's commitment. That's craft. You want crying scenes and Oscar speeches? Fine. But don't stand there pretending my work is less just because it doesn't come with violins and voiceovers. There was no applause yet. Just silence. Heavy, charged silence. Victor shifted in his seat. He was good. Years of practice had taught him to handle the heat. But this wasn't heat. This was cold, controlled, unshakable. Jason Statham wasn't defending himself. He was dismantling the entire premise of the attack. Victor tried again, this time with forced empathy. Jason, look, I'm not trying to insult your work. You're successful, hugely successful. But don't you ever wonder what legacy you're leaving behind? What people will remember you for? Jason's smile was so faint, it almost didn't exist. But it was there, and it was dangerous. He leaned forward again, his forearms resting on the edge of his knees. Let me tell you something about legacy, Victor. It's not about what you pretend to be. It's about who you are when the cameras aren't rolling, when the spotlight's gone, when it's just you and the choices you made. Victor opened his mouth, but Jason wasn't finished. You sit here and ask me if I worry about my legacy because I play the same kind of character. But you don't ask why that character resonates. Why people across the world, men, women, kids, folks in places you've never been, watch my films and say that guy gets back up. Not because it's glamorous, but because it's real. A few members of the audience began clapping, slowly, tentatively, like they were unsure if they were allowed to. Jason let the moment breathe. He wasn't in a rush. He didn't need to be. Then he turned the knife just a little more. You want to talk legacy? He said. All right, let's talk legacy. You've interviewed some of the biggest names in the world. Politicians, actors, athletes. And what do people remember you for? The time you made someone cry on live television? The time you twisted their words until they snapped? You think that's going to outlast you? Victor's smirk had vanished. Jason's gaze was steel. You build your legacy one moment at a time. And right now, your moment is slipping. The audience was no longer neutral. The mood had shifted. The murmurs turned into nods. The applause grew louder. A camera operator tilted his lens toward Jason, not because the director told him to, but because he wanted to. Victor sat still, his index fingers pressed together, his mouth slightly open. He was trying to find a foothold, a comeback, a redirect. Jason saw it, and he didn't let up. Do you know what the hardest part of my job is? He asked. Victor didn't answer. Jason continued. It's not the stunts. It's not the training. It's not even the injuries. It's staying true. In an industry that wants to box you in, label you, use you, and then discard you when you don't fit the trend anymore. He leaned in again, his tone lower, more intimate now. You call it the same role. I call it consistency, reliability, strength. I don't change for applause. I don't cry on cue to win trophies. I show up, every time, and I do the work. Victor stared at him. Jason looked at the audience. There are a lot of people out there who don't get second chances. People who don't have safety nets, who get knocked down and told they'll never get back up. Those are my people. That's what I make films for. And if that's not enough for you, he turned back to Victor, then maybe you're in the wrong chair. The audience exploded. The applause was no longer polite. It was thunderous. People clapped, cheered, some even stood. Victor looked stunned, his hands still hovering over the edge of his desk like he'd forgotten what they were for. The control was gone. The rhythm of the show had unraveled. Jason had just rewritten the script. Victor coughed lightly, tried to chuckle, then gestured to the next card, desperate to move on. Well, I guess that answers that, he muttered. Jason simply sat back in his chair, unbothered. Still, centered, because he hadn't come to play games. He came to remind the world what grit really looked like. And as the applause rolled on, one truth became clear. Victor Harland had finally met someone who didn't play by the studio rules. Victor Harland sat in his chair like a man who had just been handed a mirror for the first time. The crowd's roaring applause was still echoing across the studio, but for him, it sounded distant, almost underwater. His fingers hovered near the edge of his cue cards, but they trembled slightly, barely perceptible, yet unmistakably real. Jason Statham sat across from him, calm as stone, hands folded, posture composed. The kind of composed that wasn't rehearsed. The kind you only learned through years of being underestimated, through fights that didn't end in movie credits. Victor tried to smile. He reached for a laugh. Neither came naturally now. "I'll give you this," he said, voice hoarse from tension. "You're not the average action star." Jason raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He didn't need to. Victor glanced at his next card and found his next angle, though it came from a place far more desperate than he'd admit. His pride, scraped raw, needed a win. So, like a wounded animal, he aimed for what he thought was weakness. "Let's talk about where you come from," Victor said, sitting straighter, voice sharpening. "You weren't born into this, were you?" Jason nodded slightly, non-committal. "Born in Sydenham," Victor continued. "Your dad was a street vendor. Your mom worked multiple jobs. You were a diver for the national team, sold jewelry on the street, even hustled knockoff cologne before stock ever came along. That's not exactly a Hollywood origin story." The audience was quiet again, not out of discomfort, but anticipation. They could feel something building. Something about the way Victor's words curved into insinuation. Something about the way Jason's eyes didn't leave him. Victor pressed on. "I guess my question is, do you ever stop and wonder if you were never really meant to be here? That maybe Hollywood gave you a shot out of novelty, out of luck, and now you're just holding on before the curtain closes?" The silence after that wasn't awkward. It was electric. The audience didn't gasp or groan. They froze, because every person in that room knew the line had been crossed. The gloves were off. Jason didn't move right away. His fingers tapped once on the armrest, then stopped. He looked at Victor, not with anger, not even disappointment, just clarity. And when he finally spoke, his voice was ice wrapped in velvet. "You think it's clever, mate?" he asked. Victor chuckled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just asking the questions people think about. That's my job." Jason leaned forward, slow and surgical. "No, your job is to poke until someone breaks. But what you don't understand is people like me, we've already been broken a long time ago, and we built ourselves back stronger." Victor's expression stiffened. Jason continued. "You think I wonder if I was meant to be here? I wake up every day grateful I'm here. Because I earned it. Because I bled for it. Because I didn't get this life from favors or fame or family connections." He paused, letting the silence press in. "You think this industry gave me a shot out of luck? Let me tell you something about luck. Luck doesn't get you 20 years of consistency. Luck doesn't make audiences show up year after year. Luck doesn't survive broken ribs, torn ligaments, concussions, rejection, ridicule, and people like you trying to rewrite your story." Victor sat motionless. Jason's voice dropped, softer now, but somehow more intense. "I didn't come from money. I didn't come from acting school. I didn't have a manager with friends at Warner Brothers. I came from council flats, from market stalls, from nights where the only thing in the fridge was regret." His gaze never wavered. "And yet, I'm still here. Because I didn't wait for permission. I didn't ask if I was meant to make it. I decided to." The applause began again, louder this time, swelling, growing from a single clap to a rumble that swept across the audience. Jason didn't react to it. He stayed locked on Victor, who looked increasingly like a man wondering how the room had slipped through his fingers. Jason's tone changed, sharper now, more direct. "And let me tell you something else," he said. "When you come from where I come from, when you've scraped coins together just to get through the week, you stop caring about what people like you think of people like me. You stop waiting for validation from men in suits who've never had dirt under their fingernails." The crowd murmured approval. "You say Hollywood gave me a chance?" "Nah, I took one." He leaned back, tapping his chest with 2 fingers. "Because I knew what I had in here. And no script, no review, no critic, and no smug talk show host could take that away from me." Victor tried to laugh again, but it came out broken. His eyes darted to the control booth, the camera lights, the audience, searching for an anchor. There was none. Jason stood. Slowly, the audience stirred, unsure if this was part of the show or the end of it. But Jason didn't storm out, didn't yell. He just looked down at Victor like a man who had finally realized how small the other had always been. "You say I wasn't meant to be here," he said, voice steady. "Maybe not, but I showed up anyway. And that's what scares you, isn't it?" Victor stared up at him, silent. Jason offered the faintest nod. "I didn't need a golden ticket to get here. I made my own." He turned to the audience. "And so can any one of you." The studio exploded, clapping, whistling, cheering. Some people stood. Others slapped the backs of their chairs. A few had tears in their eyes, not from sorrow, but from recognition, from truth. Because what Jason had just said didn't sound like a celebrity talking about acting. It sounded like a man talking about life. He didn't wait for a closing statement, didn't offer a goodbye. He sat back down, calm, collected, unshaken. Victor shuffled his cards again, but none of them mattered anymore. The interview had long since ceased being his, and the crowd knew it. And that's when it really sank in. Jason wasn't just winning the room. He was owning the truth. The applause had faded, but the impact had not. Victor Harlan sat in a chair like a man who had just been handed the script of his own downfall, written not by some internet critic or a career rival, but by the very guest he had tried to belittle. Jason Statham had come in under the radar, saying little, offering nothing extra. And yet now, the audience wasn't looking at Victor. They were waiting for Jason. And Jason, he wasn't finished. He leaned slightly forward again, not to attack, not to posture, but to speak with the kind of clarity only someone who's walked through the fire without screaming can summon. "You know what I've noticed, Victor?" Jason asked, his voice even but carrying the unmistakable weight of iron behind it. "The ones who throw the most judgment around are usually the ones who've risked the least." Victor looked up, his expression tightening, fingers still trying to maintain composure over his cue cards. But it was like trying to stop an avalanche with an umbrella. Jason went on, calm and direct. "You spend your days sitting in the studio, talking to people who've done, people who've failed publicly, risked publicly, succeeded against the odds. And instead of learning something from them, you try to reduce them to sound bites." He gestured slightly, palm open. "It's always the same, isn't it? Tear them down, get the headline, play the clip the next day. Make it go viral. You sell humiliation dressed up as journalism. And maybe you think that's power." Jason tilted his head slightly. "But it's not." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Power," he said slowly, "is not being able to corner someone with a question. Power is surviving the kind of life where people like you never even bother to ask your name." The audience didn't move. They barely breathed. Jason locked eyes with Victor again. You ever walk into a casting room knowing you're not what they want, but going anyway because you need the rent money? You ever take a job you hate just to keep the lights on? You ever get told you're too rough, too raw, too unrefined, and have a stand there, smile, and say, "Thanks for the opportunity"? Victor opened his mouth, but there were no words waiting for him. Jason nodded once. Didn't think so. There was no aggression in his voice, just precision, calm, truth. "I didn't grow up in Hollywood. I didn't train at Juilliard. I didn't have a publicist when I was hustling stolen perfume on street corners. I had a dream, and I had grit, and every step I've taken, I've earned with blood and bone." He leaned back slightly, letting the weight of his words settle. "I've never asked this industry for permission to be myself. And that, Victor, is what really bothers people like you." Victor tried to smile again, tried to find the crack in Jason's armor, the familiar slip-up, the ego, or the defensiveness he could latch onto. But there was nothing. Jason was solid, grounded, built not on performance, but on principle. And then Jason did something unexpected. He turned the tables. Completely. "Let me ask you something now," Jason said calmly. Victor blinked. Jason folded his hands, his voice quiet but unwavering. "You've made a career out of asking people tough questions, digging into their insecurities, their failures. But let's be honest. When was the last time you were vulnerable on this stage?" Victor shifted slightly in his seat. I don't think that's..." "No," Jason interrupted softly. "You don't think. That's the problem. You poke and prod and provoke, but when the focus turns to you, you hide behind script. The production, The cards. The audience shifted again. A few whispered. A few nodded. A few just stared in awe, realizing this wasn't just an interview anymore. It was an unraveling. Jason continued, his tone unwavering. When was the last time you admitted to failure? To fear? To regret? Or do you keep that locked away, behind the lights, behind the makeup, behind the smugness you were like armor? Victor exhaled sharply through his nose, suddenly more defensive than defiant. I ask questions because that's my job. That's how we get to the truth. Jason nodded. Then let's get to yours. The audience murmured. Jason leaned in. What's the worst mistake you've ever made, Victor? Victor blinked. The question hit like a punch. Not because it was cruel, but because it was unflinching. He looked around, searching for an escape. The teleprompter offered no help. The producers weren't going to save him. And the audience, oh, they were all watching now. Not with judgment, but with curiosity. With the same intense gaze Victor had once reserved for his guests. Jason waited, patient. Still, you don't have to answer, he said after a long moment. But just remember, every guest you've ever tried to tear down, every human being who sat in that chair and got grilled, they didn't get the option to walk away. They had to sit there. They had to take it. Victor's mouth opened, then closed. Jason sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. You talk about legacy, Victor. But here's the truth. Legacy isn't built by making people feel small. It's built by showing people what strength really looks like. And tonight, I think they've seen the difference. The crowd clapped again, no longer for spectacle, but for something deeper. They weren't just entertained. They were moved. Victor looked down at his notes, at the printed questions. None of them made sense anymore. None of them mattered. He felt it deep in his chest. He had lost the room. No. That wasn't right. He had given it away, piece by piece, cut by cut, and now it belonged to the man he had tried to reduce to a stereotype. Jason wasn't just an action star tonight. He was something else. He was real, unbreakable. Victor rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm himself. But it wasn't the cold. It was something else entirely. Regret. Jason looked at him one last time. You tried to write my story tonight, Victor, but it's already been written. And it's not the one you expected. He gestured softly toward the crowd. They wrote it, and the audience responded, loud, proud, surging to their feet. Jason didn't bask in it. He simply nodded, acknowledging their truth, their journey, their recognition. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been told they weren't enough, and kept going anyway. The cheers continued, thundering through the studio like a rising tide that couldn't be stopped. Not by teleprompters, not by stage managers frantically whispering into headsets, and certainly not by Victor Harland, who sat frozen behind his desk, dwarfed by the moment, eclipsed by the man across from him. Jason Statham wasn't smiling. He didn't raise his arms or soak in the applause like a victory lap. He just sat there, composed, centered, eyes calm, and scanning the audience, not for praise but for connection, for truth. It was Victor who finally broke the silence, his voice cracking as he tried to reclaim his show, his space, his image. Well, he muttered, coughing once and straightening his back. Jason, this has been unexpected. Jason raised an eyebrow, not in mockery, but as if to say, unexpected for who? Victor forced a chuckle, the sound brittle. I don't usually get guests who flip the script on me. Jason leaned in one final time. No, you don't, he said quietly, because most people still care what you think of them. Victor's face stiffened, the insult landing deeper than any loud outburst ever could. But here's the thing, Jason continued, his voice like gravel smoothed by fire. I stopped caring a long time ago. About critics, about categories, about being put in a box by people who've never stepped outside their own comfort zone. The crowd nodded. Some clapped again. But Jason held up one hand gently, not to stop them, but to quiet the noise. To everyone watching, he said, turning to the audience now, not the cameras, you don't need permission to be who you are. Not from a host, not from an industry, not from anyone. His eyes scanned the rows of faces, young, old, eager, weathered. I've been told no more times than I can count. I've been told I wasn't the right look, the right background, the right education, the right everything. And I believed it at first. But then I realized. He paused. The entire studio leaned in. They don't get to decide my story. I do. There it was. The truth. The kind that doesn't fade with the credits or get clipped into a 30-second soundbite. Jason stood slowly, his movements smooth, deliberate. He reached behind his collar and unhooked the small mic clip to his shirt. Then, with care and without drama, he placed it gently on Victor's desk. No mic drop, no theatrics, just closure. He adjusted the sleeves of his jacket, then turned toward the audience, not to wave goodbye, but to acknowledge them, to thank them, to see them. And they saw him too. A man who didn't need to win the interview because he'd already won the war. The war to remain authentic in a world begging for pretense. Victor opened his mouth one last time, maybe to salvage his dignity, maybe to offer a compliment, or maybe to admit something he hadn't before. But Jason didn't wait. He nodded once, just once, toward the host. A gesture not of disrespect, but finality. Then he walked, across the stage, down the stairs, past the cameras, past the crew. His footsteps didn't echo, but somehow the whole room felt it. He didn't look back, because there was no reason to. This wasn't his world. He had simply visited, told the truth, and left it different than he found it. The cameras stayed focused on Victor, who now sat alone in his empire of lights, cards untouched in his hands, his carefully prepared script useless. The studio was still. Victor blinked, unsure of what to say, then gave a weak laugh, forced and empty. "Well," he said into the void, "that was Jason Statham." No applause followed. No music queued up. No return to normal. Because there was no normal left. What had just happened wasn't entertainment. It was an awakening, and the audience knew it. The viewers at home knew it. The crew behind the scenes felt it in their bones. The camera slowly zoomed in on Victor's face, his eyes no longer confident, no longer smug, just reflective. He looked around his stage, and for the first time, seemed to really see it. Not as a place of power, but as a cage. A place where control had always been an illusion, and tonight, someone had broken out of it. With words, with truth, with presence. Backstage, Jason didn't speak to anyone as he moved toward the exit. A few producers and assistants hovered, unsure whether to congratulate him, avoid him, or apologize. But Jason just kept walking. The hallway was quiet. The exit sign ahead glowed red. Someone called out his name, perhaps for a quote, a follow-up, a backstage moment for the digital extras. He didn't respond. He pushed the door open and stepped into the night. The cool air greeted him like an old friend. No limo, no entourage, just Jason, his shadow cast long across the pavement, walking alone, but not in silence, because the truth never echoes quietly. And that night, the world didn't talk about the spotlight. They talked about Jason Statham, not because he sold a movie, not because he threw a punch, but because he walked into a lion's den and taught the lion how to be human.